The desert stretched endlessly beneath a wide New Mexico sky, a sea of ochre and sage brushed by the soft breath of the wind. In late May of 1998, the light fell differently there, sharp, honest, and merciless. It was the kind of place that swallowed sound and memory alike, and for one man, it would become both a refuge and a grave. Mark Sullivan adjusted the straps of his worn backpack and took a deep breath. He stood at the edge of the trail near the Gila National Forest, the last known point before the world lost track of him. The morning sun burned gold across the horizon as he scribbled in his small leather journal. Day 1. The quiet feels alive. Let's see what's left of this land. He didn't know this would be his final entry, but before we dive deeper into this real-life mystery, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more gripping true stories like this one. Mark was 27, a seasoned hiker from Boulder, Colorado, who'd built his life around exploring forgotten trails. He wasn't famous, but among local hikers his name carried weight. He loved the solitude of the wild, the way it forced him to listen. Friends said he had a mapmaker's heart and a poet's soul. His sister Lisa used to tease him, "You're chasing ghosts in the desert." He would just smile and reply, "Some ghosts are worth finding." That spring he had chosen a remote route near the San Mateo Mountains, known for its rugged cliffs and unpredictable weather. Locals warned him it wasn't a trail to walk alone. "You get lost out there," one old rancher told him at a gas station. "You stay lost." Mark laughed it off, confident in his skill and preparation. His backpack was neatly packed, water, rations, compass, journal, and an old camera his late father had given him. At a diner in Truth or Consequences, Mark had breakfast with a few other travelers. The waitress, a woman named Ruby, would later remember him clearly. He was polite, she told reporters. Quiet but kind, paid in cash and left a generous tip, said he was heading west to catch the sunset. That was the last time anyone saw him alive. When he failed to return after 10 days, his family grew concerned. Lisa called the local sheriff's office, her voice trembling. "He's never missed a check-in," she said. Within hours, the search began. Volunteers, rangers, and locals combed the trails. Helicopters circled overhead, their blades slicing through the still air. For days, they found only fragments, a tent, a torn map, and a camera case buried in sand. But no Mark. Whispers began to spread through the small desert towns. Some said he'd fallen into a ravine. Others hinted at something darker. People who lived off-grid, territorial and suspicious of outsiders. The desert had taken him, or so it seemed. Yet even in silence, the land kept its secrets. And 20 years later, one of those secrets would resurface, shaking the small towns of New Mexico to their core. Mark Sullivan had always belonged to the wilderness more than he did to any city. Born and raised in Boulder, Colorado, he grew up at the edge of the Rocky Mountains, where mornings smelled of pine and cold air, and evenings carried the hum of coyotes in the distance. His father, Thomas Sullivan, had been a park ranger, disciplined, quiet, and deeply respectful of the land. From him, Mark learned not only how to survive outdoors, but how to listen to it. When Mark was 9, his father told him, "The forest talks, son. Not with words, but with signs. You just have to pay attention." That lesson never left him. Even after his father's death from a sudden heart attack when Mark was 20, he carried those words like a compass inside his chest. Lisa, his younger sister by 3 years, often said he reminded her of their dad. Steady, patient, impossible to rush. She adored him, but worried constantly about his solo trips. "You don't always have to do everything alone," she told him once, standing on his porch with a cup of coffee between her hands. He smiled, brushing a lock of hair from her face. "It's not about being alone, Lise. It's about hearing things clearly." After finishing college with a degree in environmental science, Mark could have taken a safe job with the Forest Service. Instead, he started documenting forgotten trails, paths erased from official maps, but still alive in the stories of locals. He wrote articles for small outdoor magazines, sold photos to travel journals, and posted long reflections on online hiking forums that were just beginning to grow in the late 90s. His style was simple, thoughtful, poetic. He was fascinated by places that had been abandoned, especially those around the New Mexico border. "There's something ancient there," he wrote in one of his essays. "It's not just the land, it's the silence. It has memory." Friends sometimes joined him for short treks, but Mark preferred solitude. He said it made him more honest. His apartment was modest, maps pinned to the walls, stacks of notebooks filled with coordinates, and a single photo of him and Lisa as kids, sitting on a fallen log. He lived simply, ate little, and saved every dollar for the next trail. Still, beneath that calm spirit lived a restless drive. Lisa noticed it. "You're searching for something," she said one Christmas. He had shrugged. "Maybe I'm just looking for a place that feels like home." As 1998 began, Mark told her about a new project, a journey across parts of New Mexico's wilderness that few had documented. It wasn't for work, it was personal. "I want to trace the old trade routes," he said. "The ones people forgot," she frowned. "Promise me you'll call every few days." He nodded, though his eyes drifted toward the window, already miles ahead. She didn't know that would be the last promise he ever made. The morning Mark left for New Mexico was quiet, the kind of stillness that seems to hold its breath before a storm. Lisa stood by his old Jeep Cherokee, arms crossed, watching him pack the last of his gear: compass, journal, maps sealed in plastic, and the same worn camera that had followed him through every journey. The air smelled faintly of gasoline and dry earth. "You sure about this?" she asked, forcing a small laugh to mask her unease. "Yeah," he said without looking up. "I've been planning this one for months." Lisa leaned against the door, frowning. "It's not the hike that worries me. Well, you know what people say about those parts. The land can swallow you whole." He smiled faintly. "That's the point, isn't it?" Then softer, "Don't worry, I'll call when I reach the ranger station." But he never did. Mark's route stretched across the San Mateo Mountains, an area both magnificent and merciless. The trails cut through canyons where shadows clung even at noon, and winds could turn from gentle to brutal in a single hour. Local hikers often avoided the region, not because of superstition, but because it demanded absolute respect. The terrain had no mercy for arrogance or mistakes. At a small gas station in Socorro, he stopped for supplies. The attendant, an older man with sun-leathered skin, eyed his maps. "You headed west?" "Yeah, toward the San Mateos," Mark replied. The man shook his head. "Don't head west alone. Not this season. Storms roll in fast, and those they don't forgive." Mark nodded politely, though he'd heard similar warnings before. As he drove off, the man watched him go, muttering under his breath, "Another one chasing ghosts." By late afternoon, Mark reached a clearing where he planned to set up camp for the night. He wrote in his journal before sunset, "The wind here feels older than time. Found an animal trail leading toward the ridge. Will follow tomorrow." The handwriting was neat, calm, certain. That evening, a light breeze rustled the juniper trees. Coyotes howled in the distance, their cries echoing across the valley. Mark warmed a can of beans over his small camp stove and stared at the horizon until the sky turned violet. The stars arrived one by one, bright, sharp, infinite. He felt alive, but as darkness deepened, unease began to creep in. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a faint sound echoed, like footsteps on gravel too heavy to be wind. He paused, listening, but it faded quickly. Probably just the shifting ground, he told himself. Still, he noted it in his journal before turning in. "Heard something strange tonight. Maybe an animal. Still feel different." The next morning he packed up early, leaving no trace behind except footprints that the wind soon erased. His last recorded note was short, almost rushed. "Heading deeper today. The land feels heavier." And from that point forward, Mark Sullivan vanished into the wilderness. It didn't take long for Mark's disappearance to send ripples through the small towns of New Mexico. The first day, the search was casual. A few concerned phone calls, a couple of locals heading out in their trucks to retrace Mark's steps, expecting to find him just off the trail, perhaps nursing a sprained ankle or waiting out a storm. But the second day was different. Panic began to grow. Lisa couldn't sit still. She paced her apartment in Albuquerque, biting her nails. She tried calling his phone again. No answer. The voicemail box was full. She texted him, "Mark, where are you? Please call." But the message sat, unread. By the third day, the authorities were involved. Sheriff Rick Morales, a local lawman who'd seen many missing person cases in his time, was leading the charge. "We'll find him," he assured Lisa over the phone. His voice was steady, but she could hear the unspoken concern there. The desert had a way of swallowing people whole, and the San Mateos were notoriously unforgiving. Mark's friends rallied, and so did strangers. People from nearby towns gathered, offering their help. Rangers, retired locals, hikers. The search expanded. Helicopters hovered above the jagged cliffs, scanning the ravines and gorges where Mark might have slipped. They combed through washes and dry creek beds, calling his name. But the desert remained silent. It was only when a group of volunteers found a tattered piece of Mark's backpack, buried near an abandoned shack deep in the mountains, that they began to worry something darker had happened. The pack was torn and empty, save for a camera case. It didn't make sense. There was no sign of Mark, no clue where he had gone, no trail. Sheriff Morales called in a special task force, and for the next 2 weeks they scoured the wilderness, but the clues were few. The search focused on areas near the Gila forest and the cliffs where Mark had been headed. One volunteer found his tent, a small lightweight model half buried in a wash, its door open but nothing inside. His food supplies were gone, but it didn't appear as if he had packed up quickly. It looked like he'd just disappeared. Mark's camera case was the strangest part. Inside were his hiking photos, some of which were blurry and strange, as though they'd been taken in a hurry. A few images seemed to show a figure in the background, a man Mark didn't mention in any of his journal entries. There was no face, just the outline of someone standing near the base of a cliff, almost lost in the shadows. It was a detail that sent a chill down Lisa's spine when she saw it. Still, there were no answers. And after the official search was called off, rumors began to surface. Some locals claimed Mark had encountered someone dangerous. Others speculated about wild animal attacks, or even a freak accident. But whatever the reason, Mark Sullivan had simply vanished, leaving behind nothing but questions. And for years, that's all there was. Questions. 2 decades had passed since Mark Sullivan's disappearance, and the small town of Truth or Consequences, New Mexico, had learned to live with its ghosts. People still talked about him, especially in the diner where he had last been seen. But time had a way of dulling the sharp edges of tragedy, and life moved on. Yet for those who knew Mark, his absence was a scar that never fully healed. Lisa, now a reporter for a local Albuquerque newspaper, had spent those 20 years chasing her brother's memory. She wrote articles on missing persons, covering cases that mirrored Mark's, but never quite matched the rawness of her own pain. She buried herself in her work, hoping that through reporting she could somehow make sense of his disappearance. But deep down, she knew she was running from something she couldn't escape. It wasn't until 2018 that the case came back to life, and it did so in a way that no one could have predicted. A phone call woke Lisa on a cold morning in October. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, gruff, and filled with the kind of tension that told her this wasn't a random inquiry. "Ms. Sullivan," the voice said, "this is Agent Ramirez with the FBI. We've got a lead on your brother's case." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She'd heard nothing in years, nothing concrete anyway. She had become used to the silence, the unanswered questions. But now something was stirring. "I know this is hard," Agent Ramirez continued, "but we've got someone in custody. A man named Bobby Cantrell. He's been linked to your brother's disappearance." Lisa's heart skipped. Bobby Cantrell. She had heard the name before. Cantrell had been a volunteer firefighter in nearby Magdalena, a town known for its tight-knit community and shared history. But there was something else, something darker, that Lisa recalled. Cantrell had been one of the volunteers who had helped with the original search efforts when Mark went missing. He had been there, pretending to care, even as the search turned up nothing. Lisa sat up in bed, her mind racing. "What does this mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. It means we've finally found a connection. Cantrell's been living under a different name for years, and he's now in custody. We believe he knows exactly what happened to your brother." Lisa's stomach twisted. She was struck by the enormity of it. The man who had helped search for Mark was now a suspect in his disappearance. Could he have been involved all along, or had he simply known something everyone else had missed? The case was reopening. The long-dormant investigation was now a live wire, crackling with possibility. Lisa had to know more. She had to face the truth. After all these years, there might finally be answers. But even as the hope began to stir in her chest, a part of her recoiled. What if the truth was more terrible than she could bear? Lisa sat in her small, cluttered apartment, staring at the FBI's email on her screen. The words were sharp and cold, but they still held the weight of an old wound being reopened. Bobby Cantrell, in custody, linked to your brother's disappearance. The phone rang just as she clicked the reply button. "Lisa, it's Rick Morales," said the familiar voice. Even after all these years, Sheriff Morales' tone was unmistakable, gravelly, authoritative, yet filled with a quiet sadness. "I know this has been a long time coming. I'm going to help you get the answers you need." Lisa's heart skipped. She had not spoken to Morales since the case went cold. When he retired a few years after Mark's disappearance, he had seemed to vanish as completely as Mark had. The old sheriff was a figure from the past now, someone she thought had moved on, leaving the mystery behind. "Sheriff, are you really going to help?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am. I've been following the investigation from the sidelines, but when this Cantrell lead surfaced, I knew I had to be involved. I never thought I'd hear from you again, but it looks like the past is catching up with us." Lisa didn't know what to say. Her emotions were a whirlwind: relief, anger, disbelief, but above all, confusion. Why now? Why after all this time? And why was Cantrell's name resurfacing after he had helped with the search? "I'll meet you at the station tomorrow," Morales continued. "I've got some information you need to hear. It's not just about Cantrell, there's more we need to uncover." The next morning, Lisa drove to the small sheriff's office in Socorro. The air was crisp and dry, the kind of coolness that marked the end of summer in New Mexico. As she parked her car outside, she caught sight of Sheriff Morales waiting by the door. His usual weathered look had softened with age, but there was still a quiet strength in his posture. "You okay?" he asked as she stepped out of her car. Lisa gave him a small, uncertain smile. "I don't know if I'm okay, but I'm here." The sheriff led her inside, where the faint smell of coffee and old paper hung in the air. The walls were lined with faded case files and photographs. "It's not much, but it's home," he said with a half smile. He motioned to a small table in the back of the room, where a stack of documents lay. "I've been keeping an eye on Cantrell ever since he vanished." "The man wasn't right," Morales said, sliding a manila folder across the table. "We thought he was just a volunteer, a good guy, helping out with the search, but there were things we missed. Things I wish I had caught earlier." Lisa opened the folder, and her eyes went immediately to a photograph at the top. It was blurry, but unmistakably, it was Cantrell, and behind him, almost hidden in the shadows, was Mark, his face just visible in the background, looking over his shoulder at something, or someone. Morales leaned in, his voice low. "Cantrell had been in that area before, long before your brother showed up. I'm telling you, Lisa, there's something off about him." As Lisa studied the photo, her thoughts raced. Was this the key? Had Cantrell been involved all along? "We're going to get to the bottom of this," Morales said, his hand resting on the folder. "I promised you answers, and I intend to keep that promise." But as the sheriff's words sank in, Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that the answers might be darker than she had ever imagined. Lisa sat at the table, her hands trembling slightly, as she flipped through the folders Sheriff Morales had handed her. The photo of Mark, partially obscured in the shadows behind Bobby Cantrell, weighed on her like a stone. She had seen that image 100 times in her mind, but now it was real. Proof that Mark had encountered this man before he disappeared. It was a piece of the puzzle, one she wasn't ready to face. As she scanned through the other papers, her eyes landed on something that made her stop. a set of coordinates hastily scribbled on a scrap of paper. They weren't in any official file. They looked like something Mark might have written himself. She picked it up carefully, as though afraid it might dissolve in her hands. The numbers seemed familiar to her. They were the same numbers she had seen in his journal entries, the coordinates Mark had marked down the night before he vanished. He had written them in a section that she hadn't paid much attention to, focusing instead on his descriptions of the land and his feelings of isolation. But now they were suddenly the key to unlocking the mystery. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. She knew where those coordinates led. They pointed to an isolated area near the Gila National Forest, a place Mark had planned to explore, a place that was off the beaten path, one that few people ever visited. She had always assumed Mark had ventured out there on his own, following a trail or a whisper of the land. But now, with this new information, it seemed possible that Cantrell had known about this location long before Mark had. Sheriff Morales was sitting across from her, watching as she connected the dots in her mind. He saw her eyes widen when she made the realization. "That's where Mark was headed," Lisa whispered, her voice barely audible. "I think we might have been looking in the wrong places all this time," Morales said. "Cantrell might have been guiding him without us even knowing. Or worse, he could have been waiting for him." The possibility sent a chill through Lisa's body. Had Mark been led into a trap? Was this the reason he had felt uneasy before his disappearance? Lisa took a deep breath and pushed the folder aside. She needed to focus. There were more clues to uncover. "Let's go to the place where those coordinates lead," she said, her voice firm. "We need to see it for ourselves. If Mark was out there, we might find something we missed." Morales nodded, his face hardening. "I'll get the team ready. We'll head out tomorrow morning." The sun had started to set, casting long shadows across the room, but Lisa barely noticed. Her mind was already racing ahead, envisioning the desolate landscape where Mark had last wandered. She had waited so long for this moment, and now that it had arrived, the weight of the truth was almost unbearable. As she stood up, she gathered the papers together and slipped them into her bag. "We're going to find him, Sheriff. I'm sure of it." Morales didn't answer immediately, but his eyes spoke volumes. He had his doubts too, but together they would face whatever lay ahead. Tomorrow they would search for Mark in the last place anyone had thought to look. The drive to the location marked by the coordinates felt endless. The road wound through the dry, barren landscape, the hot sun casting an oppressive weight on the land. The heat shimmered in waves across the horizon, and the silence in the car was almost as suffocating as the desert itself. Lisa sat in the passenger seat, gripping the edge of the seat, her eyes scanning the landscape as if it held the answers she'd been searching for all these years. Sheriff Morales drove with his usual steady focus, his face expressionless but taut with anticipation. "You think we're going to find something?" Lisa finally asked, her voice breaking the silence. Morales didn't take his eyes off the road. "I don't know, but I've been doing this job long enough to know when something doesn't sit right. There's a reason we never found Mark. Maybe this is where we should have been looking all along." Lisa nodded, but her stomach churned. She had no idea what to expect. The thought that something had been hidden here just beneath the surface felt wrong, almost like disturbing a grave. But she had no choice. She had to find Mark, or at least find out what had happened to him. As they neared the coordinates, the landscape began to change. The flat, dusty ground gave way to a rocky outcrop, jagged cliffs rising up from the earth like ancient teeth. The air seemed to grow thicker, the stillness heavier. It was a place that felt both beautiful and foreboding, a place that held secrets in the shadows of its rocks. Morales parked the truck at the base of the cliffs, the dust settling around them in a fine, golden haze. He looked over at Lisa. "You ready for this?" Lisa's mouth was dry, but she nodded. "Let's do it." They got out of the truck, the heat pressing against them like a physical force. The ground beneath their feet was uneven, cracked open by time and the relentless wind. It didn't feel like a place where people were meant to be, as if the land itself was resisting them. They walked in silence, moving carefully, scanning the area. The jagged rocks around them cast long, ominous shadows, and every step seemed to echo louder than the last. It wasn't just the harshness of the land that unnerved Lisa. It was the eerie feeling that they weren't alone. After an hour of searching, Lisa's foot caught on something hard in the ground. She stumbled, and as she steadied herself, she glanced down. What she saw stopped her in her tracks. There, partially buried under a pile of rocks and dirt, was something unmistakable. It was a piece of a backpack, Mark's backpack. Her breath caught in her throat. "Sheriff, over here!" Morales rushed to her side, his face hardening as he looked down at the item. It was unmistakable, the same fabric, the same design, and it was buried here, as if someone had intentionally hidden it. Lisa crouched down, her hands shaking as she gently brushed away the dirt. The rest of the backpack was gone, but the shape of it remained, marked by the weathered fabric and the unmistakable patch that had once carried Mark's hiking logo. "This is it," she whispered. "He was here. He was so close." Sheriff Morales' expression darkened. "We need to keep looking. If he was here, then something else is." The weight of the discovery hit Lisa like a wave, but even as relief mixed with grief, she couldn't shake the growing sense that this was just the beginning. Whatever Mark had encountered out here, whatever had happened to him, was still buried beneath the rocks waiting to be uncovered. The discovery of Mark's backpack marked a turning point in the investigation. Lisa's hands were still trembling from the find as she sat in the truck with Sheriff Morales. They had carefully documented the location, taking photographs and making sure that every detail was recorded. It felt like they had finally unearthed a clue that had been buried for far too long. But even as they drove back toward town, Lisa knew this was just the beginning. The question now wasn't what had happened, it was who had done it. "Do you think we'll find more?" Lisa asked, her voice hoarse. She wasn't sure whether she wanted to know the answer. Morales glanced over at her. His expression was grim. If he was buried here, someone wanted it hidden. "But we won't know until we dig deeper." His voice was steady, but there was something else behind it, a flicker of doubt. He had spent decades investigating cases that never went anywhere, and the weight of the unknown was something he knew all too well. The next morning, word spread quickly through the small town of Magdalena. It had been 2 days since their discovery, and the sheriff's office had been working non-stop to process the evidence. But the real shock came when a warrant was issued for Bobby Cantrell's arrest. The man everyone had known as a quiet, helpful neighbor, a volunteer firefighter who had been present during Mark's initial search, was suddenly the prime suspect in a case that had remained cold for 20 years. It was impossible to believe at first. Cantrell had been the kind of man who helped organize the search parties, who had stood alongside the community, offering his assistance when everyone feared the worst. How could he be involved? But as more evidence piled up, the answer became clear. His connection to the land, the same land Mark had been exploring, was undeniable. Lisa was at the sheriff's office when the news broke. She was sitting at a desk, staring at the photographs of Mark's last known trail when the phone rang. Morales picked it up, and Lisa could hear the tension in his voice as he spoke to someone on the other end. When he hung up, his face was ashen. "Bobby Cantrell has been arrested," Morales said, the words slow and heavy. "He was caught in Arizona with a fake ID, and in his bag." "We found Mark's journal." Lisa's heart stopped. She couldn't breathe. She had read Mark's journal hundreds of times, had pored over it, searching for any clue, any hint about what had happened. And now Cantrell had it. It was almost too much to process. How had Cantrell ended up with Mark's belongings? Why had he been carrying them all these years? The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, but the picture they were forming was far darker than Lisa had ever imagined. The arrest of Bobby Cantrell shook the entire community. Those who had once called him a friend now looked at him with suspicion, and those who had once mourned the loss of Mark Sullivan found themselves confronted with a truth they weren't ready to face. As the news spread through town, Lisa stood in the sheriff's office holding her breath. It was the first sign of justice in 2 decades, but even as the arrest was made, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was still missing. They had found Cantrell, but they had yet to find the full truth of what had happened to her brother. And that truth, she feared, was more terrifying than she could imagine. Lisa's world tilted on its axis as the news of Bobby Cantrell's arrest continued to spread. The town of Magdalena was abuzz, its once quiet streets now filled with whispers, theories, and unanswered questions. Lisa had spent years chasing shadows, but now, finally, she had something solid to hold on to. The man who had once volunteered alongside the search parties for her brother's disappearance was in custody, and with his arrest, the entire community felt the tremors of a long-buried secret surfacing. But even as the weight of this revelation settled in, Lisa felt a storm brewing inside her, one that she wasn't sure she could weather. The sheriff's office had called her in that morning to hear Cantrell's statement. The room was sterile and harshly lit, the hum of the fluorescent lights filling the silence. Lisa sat in a chair across from Sheriff Morales, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She tried to steady her breath, but her heart was racing, and her mind was a mess of tangled thoughts. The statement from Cantrell was chilling. He claimed he had found Mark's belongings in the wilderness, after Mark had fallen and disappeared. He'd kept the journal, he said, as a memento, and the fake ID had been an attempt to escape his own past. But the more the detectives pressed him, the less his story held water. The inconsistencies were glaring. "I don't believe him," Lisa finally said, breaking the silence. "He's lying, Sheriff. There's something he's not telling us." Morales nodded, his face grim. "I know. We're digging into his past now, looking for anything that might explain why he's been hiding this." Lisa's mind wandered back to the time when Cantrell had been part of the original search. He had been the one to comfort her, to help her through the pain of not knowing. He had stood by offering false hope, all while carrying Mark's journal with him. The betrayal stung, and it hurt more than she had expected. She felt like the ground beneath her was shifting, the people she had trusted for years becoming strangers. When she left the sheriff's office, she felt like she was walking through a fog. The streets of Magdalena were unfamiliar to her now. She had lived here her whole life, but it was as if the town had changed overnight. The faces she passed seemed uncertain, unsure whether to look her way, as though they were all carrying a piece of the truth she had yet to fully uncover. Back in her apartment, Lisa collapsed onto the couch. The weight of everything, the years of unanswered questions, the shocking arrest, the betrayal by someone she once trusted, it was all too much. She closed her eyes, her body trembling. Her grief, her anger, her disbelief, they all swirled together in a storm that threatened to consume her. But through the storm, a flicker of resolve began to grow. "I can't stop now," she whispered to herself. "Not now, not after all this time." The path forward wasn't clear, but Lisa knew one thing for certain. She was going to get the answers she needed, no matter what it took. Tomorrow, the investigation would continue, and Lisa would be right there, determined to uncover the truth no matter where it led. The courtroom was silent, except for the faint sound of shuffling papers and the occasional cough from the audience. It was a crisp, grey morning in Albuquerque, and Lisa sat in the front row, her heart pounding in her chest. The weight of 20 years of pain and uncertainty pressed heavily on her shoulders as she watched Bobby Cantrell being escorted into the courtroom by officers. He looked nothing like the man she remembered, the helpful volunteer, the friendly neighbor. Now his face was drawn, his eyes empty. There was no trace of the man who had once helped search for her brother. He was a stranger, someone who had deceived not just her, but an entire community. Cantrell's defense attorney was making the case that the charges were overblown, that there was no definitive proof of foul play, and that the journal, though found in Cantrell's possession, didn't prove he had anything to do with Mark's disappearance. The prosecutor, however, was painting a much darker picture. They argued that Cantrell's actions were intentional, that he had deliberately concealed Mark's belongings and misled the investigation for years. Lisa couldn't help but replay every conversation she had had with Cantrell, every moment she had trusted him. How could he stand there so cold, as if none of this mattered? The jury was listening intently, and Lisa could feel their eyes occasionally flicker toward her. She sat still, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her jaw clenched. This was her brother's life they were debating, and she would not let them forget that. "I want to call to the stand someone who can speak to the relationship between the defendant and Mark Sullivan," the prosecutor said, breaking Lisa's concentration. The courtroom doors opened, and Sheriff Morales walked in. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. He was a man she trusted, a man who had been there from the beginning, guiding her through the dark days after Mark vanished. Now he was here to testify against the man who had lied, who had helped cover up Mark's fate. "Sheriff Morales," the prosecutor began, "can you describe your interactions with Bobby Cantrell during the search for Mark Sullivan in 1998? Morales stood tall, his voice steady as he responded. Cantrell was involved in the search efforts. He volunteered with the rest of the community. But as the investigation continued, there were red flags. Cantrell became evasive when asked about his whereabouts. He was too familiar with the terrain Mark had been exploring, and there were rumors about his past that never sat right with me." Lisa's mind raced. Every word Sheriff Morales spoke hit harder than the last. He had known. He had always known that something about Cantrell didn't add up. "Did you ever confront Cantrell directly about your suspicions?" the prosecutor pressed. "I did," Morales said, "but he always deflected, always had an excuse. He seemed more interested in controlling the narrative of the search, rather than finding the truth." I knew then that something was off. Lisa's chest tightened, and she had to fight the urge to look away. She couldn't afford to break down now, not when they were so close. Cantrell, on the other hand, sat with his head down, avoiding the sheriff's gaze. It was a small but telling gesture. A man who had nothing to hide would never act like this. The rest of the trial was filled with testimony and evidence that painted a damning picture of Bobby Cantrell. But even as the case against him grew stronger, Lisa couldn't shake the lingering question. Why? Why had Cantrell done this? What had driven him to hide Mark's fate for so long? As the first day of the trial concluded, Lisa walked out of the courtroom, her mind exhausted but her resolve stronger than ever. The truth was unfolding before her eyes, but it wasn't over yet. The road to justice for Mark was just beginning. The trial had already taken a toll on Lisa. The courtroom had been filled with tension, but today it felt different. The prosecution was winding down its case, and the defense was struggling to keep up. Every shred of evidence seemed to point directly to Bobby Cantrell's guilt. But there was still something lingering in the back of Lisa's mind, something that hadn't yet been answered, something she couldn't let go of. The trial was now entering its most critical phase. The defense had called for a recess after presenting their shaky arguments, but Lisa knew she had to dig deeper. She had to face whatever truths lay beneath the surface, truths that she'd been too afraid to confront. Lisa spent that afternoon in the courtroom's library, her fingers flipping through case files and police reports. Every document, every piece of evidence seemed to point to one glaring fact. Cantrell had been hiding something far darker than anyone had realized. The more Lisa read, the more she felt her heart race. But it was the photos, the ones Cantrell had kept from the original search, that shook her to her core. The blurred photographs from Mark's camera, which had been found in Cantrell's possession, had never been properly examined. Lisa had seen them before, images of desert landscapes, distant horizons, but something in one particular photo made her stomach turn. It was a close-up shot, almost too clear. Mark's face, barely visible, was shadowed by the figure of a man. Cantrell's face was barely discernible in the background, but it was unmistakable. Lisa could hardly breathe as she stared at the image. This wasn't just some random encounter. The picture showed a moment of tension, a moment that Mark had captured. Had Mark known something about Cantrell that he hadn't shared in his journal? Had he felt the danger closing in, too late to do anything about it? She slammed the folder closed and left the room in a hurry. Her mind was spinning, the room too hot and too tight. She had to get out. The weight of this revelation was overwhelming. The next day, Lisa took a walk along the edge of the Gila National Forest, the land that had been the setting for her brother's last adventure. It was quiet out here, eerily so. The wind rustled through the trees, but it felt like the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting. Every step felt heavier than the last, and the thought of Mark in this very place, walking alone, made her heart ache. She paused by a rock outcrop, the same one she had seen in Mark's journal entries. This was where he had written about his unease, the place where he had taken that last photo. Lisa ran her fingers along the rough surface of the stone, as though trying to reach back in time, to feel what he had felt in that moment. It was then that she realized something crucial. Mark had known something he hadn't written about, something he hadn't been able to express fully. He had captured a moment of truth in that photo, a moment he had been too afraid to explain. Cantrell had been watching him, her breath caught as a new wave of understanding washed over her. Bobby Cantrell hadn't just been an innocent bystander. He had been stalking Mark, watching him, controlling him, and perhaps even threatening him. Mark's camera, his journal, the photos, they were fragments of the truth that had been hidden away for far too long. Lisa turned back toward the road, feeling both lighter and heavier all at once. The pieces of the puzzle were finally starting to fit together, and with them a new question arose. Was the man sitting in that courtroom truly guilty of murder? Or had something even darker been at play, something she had yet to fully understand? The truth was within her reach, but Lisa knew she would have to confront the deepest darkness before it could ever come to light. The courtroom was still, the kind of silence that made Lisa feel as though the entire world was holding its breath. The trial had lasted weeks, but today was different. It was the day everything had been leading to. The judge had given his final instructions, and now the jury was deliberating. It felt like an eternity, but Lisa knew this was the moment, the one she had been waiting for her entire life. She sat alone in the back of the courtroom, her fingers gripping the edge of her seat. Sheriff Morales was beside her, his presence a comforting anchor, though the tension in his posture revealed just how deeply invested he had become in this case. He hadn't just been the one to uncover the evidence. He had been her rock in these turbulent months. Lisa tried to focus, but her mind was a whirlwind. Mark's disappearance, Bobby Cantrell's lies, the fragments of the truth she had pieced together, they all seemed to collide in her head. She wanted the truth, but she was also terrified of what that truth might be. Was this all there was to it? Or was there something even darker she had yet to uncover? The door to the jury room opened, and the foreman stepped forward. The room seemed to hold its breath as he approached the bench. Lisa could feel her heart racing, her palms sweating. "We have a verdict," the foreman said. The room became eerily quiet as the judge instructed the jury to deliver the verdict. The words felt heavy in the air as they were read aloud. Guilty of second-degree murder. The words crashed over Lisa like a wave. Her body stiffened, her eyes wide in disbelief. The emotions hit her all at once: relief, anger, confusion, and grief. She had been waiting for this moment for so long, but now that it had arrived, she wasn't sure how to feel. The man who had helped hide Mark's fate was now going to prison for it, but was it enough? Was it truly justice? The room erupted in murmurs, some people quietly celebrating the conviction, others shocked by the finality of the decision. Lisa could barely hear anything over the pounding of her heart, the rush of blood in her ears. The years of searching, the pain of not knowing, all of it had led her to this moment, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The bailiff called for order in the court, and Lisa finally took a shaky breath. Sheriff Morales placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's over, Lisa," he said softly. But Lisa wasn't so sure. As she walked out of the courtroom, she felt a strange mixture of emptiness and satisfaction. The battle had been won, but it hadn't brought her the peace she had expected. She had uncovered the truth, but she still didn't fully understand it. Cantrell was guilty, but what had motivated him? What had he hoped to gain by keeping Mark's fate hidden for all those years? For the first time in months, Lisa allowed herself to exhale. But as she stepped outside into the bright, unforgiving sun, a part of her knew that the final chapter of this story hadn't been written yet. Justice had been served, but the truth still lingered just beyond her grasp. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough for now. It had been weeks since the trial ended, and Lisa still hadn't found peace. The conviction of Bobby Cantrell brought an end to the legal battle, but the emotional wounds ran deeper. She had spent so many years searching for answers, for closure, but now that she had it, she wasn't sure what to do with it. The grief didn't disappear with the verdict. In many ways, it felt heavier. Mark's absence still haunted her, and though Cantrell was behind bars, the land where Mark had disappeared, where they had last been together, still held a strange pull. Lisa found herself back in the Gila National Forest, standing in front of the rock outcrop, where Mark had taken his final photo. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the rugged terrain. It felt different this time, calmer, quieter, as if the land itself was waiting for her to finally understand it. Her hand brushed against the stone where she had stood before, the same spot Mark had described in his journal. She closed her eyes, imagining what he might have felt, what he might have seen in those last moments. Had he known Cantrell was following him? Had he felt the weight of the danger lurking in the shadows? She opened her eyes and stared at the horizon. The silence was profound, and yet she felt a strange sense of connection to Mark in this place. She could almost hear his voice, quiet but reassuring, telling her that everything would be okay. Maybe he had come to this spot for a reason, to find peace in the quiet solitude of the desert. Maybe he had found something here that she still couldn't fully understand. Lisa sat down on a nearby rock, her fingers lightly tracing the contours of the landscape as she let her thoughts drift. She had spent so many years pushing through her grief, holding on to the hope that one day the truth would set her free. But now that she had uncovered it, she realized that closure wasn't something you could force. It wasn't an end. It was a journey. A journey that still had its unresolved moments, its lingering questions. But that was okay. She let out a breath, her shoulders relaxing for the first time in a long while. The weight of the past didn't feel quite so suffocating now. It would never fully go away, and that was something she had come to accept. But it wasn't the end. It was a new beginning, a chance to move forward, to honor Mark's memory without the burden of unanswered questions. She would never forget him, and she would carry his spirit with her, no matter where life took her next. Lisa stood up and looked around the vast open land. She felt a deep sense of peace settle within her. The landscape, once foreign and haunting, now felt like a place of reflection, a place where she could heal. With one last glance at the horizon, Lisa turned and began walking back, the sun setting behind her. The journey wasn't over, but it had changed, and for the first time in years she felt ready to face whatever came next. Lisa stood in front of the small crowd gathered at the podium, her hands gripping the edges of the wood. It was a public speaking event, one she had been invited to after the trial. The invitation had come from a local organization focused on wilderness safety, a group dedicated to helping families avoid the kinds of tragedies that had haunted her for years. Lisa had agreed to speak, but now that she was standing there ready to share her story, she found herself feeling nervous, exposed. "Thank you all for being here today," she began, her voice steady but quieter than she intended. She could feel the weight of her words pressing down on her. "I've spent years chasing a truth I wasn't sure I'd ever find. And now that I have it, I've learned something important. The journey to understanding doesn't just stop when you find the answers. It continues, and it shapes you along the way." Her eyes scanned the room, settling on a few familiar faces in the front. People from the trial, the ones who had supported her through this long ordeal. Sheriff Morales was seated in the back, his face soft with encouragement. Lisa had learned so much from him over the past few months, about patience, about perseverance, and about the importance of asking the hard questions. She was here now because of the years he had spent, quietly pushing for justice even when the case seemed hopeless. "I never thought I'd be standing here today," Lisa continued, her voice growing a bit stronger. "I never thought I'd find myself sharing the story of my brother's disappearance, of the man who deceived us all. But Mark's story is one of survival. It's about the land he loved and the way it shaped him. It's also about the people who are left behind, how we continue, how we heal." She paused, letting the weight of her words hang in the air. There was a quiet understanding in the room now. Lisa could feel it, a connection that hadn't been there when she first started speaking. She wasn't just telling her brother's story anymore, she was telling her own. Mark was more than just a missing person. He was a man who lived for adventure, for exploring the unknown. He understood the wilderness in ways that most people don't. But when he went missing, I couldn't understand why I couldn't find him. It wasn't just the land that was elusive. It was the truth. It took years to understand that sometimes the truth doesn't come in the way you expect. It comes in pieces. In fragments. Lisa's voice wavered, but she pushed through. In the end, I found the truth and I found peace. It's not the kind of peace I expected, but it's enough. We all need to understand that closure isn't something you can demand. It's something you learn to carry with you, even when the weight feels unbearable. She took a deep breath, her gaze lifting to the audience, meeting their eyes one by one. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand everything that happened, but I do know this. Mark's memory will live on. And I'll carry that with me no matter where I go. There was a long silence after she finished speaking, and then slowly, the room erupted in applause. Lisa's chest tightened, but a tear slid down her cheek. She wasn't sure if it was from relief or from the weight of all the years she had carried, but in that moment it didn't matter. The answers had come, and with them a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. As she stepped down from the podium, Sheriff Morales was already standing, waiting for her. He gave her a nod, a silent recognition of everything she had accomplished. "You did good, Lisa," he said quietly. And for the first time in years, Lisa believed it. The journey wasn't over, but it had taken a final turn. And with it, she was ready to begin again,